The alarm on my console screamed before I even opened my eyes, and I knew, in that first breath, that something had gone wrong beyond anything we had trained for. My name is Laura Bennett, and I was the human representative aboard the Council Station Halvora, sitting in a chair that was never meant for a species like mine, listening to voices argue about the fate of a colony I had visited only weeks before. The colony was called Marin Field. 400 people lived there, growing food in domes, mapping storms on a moon that had no name before we gave it one. It was approved. Every signature the council required had been collected, stamped, and filed. I had personally carried the final approval myself. Then the transmission came through, cutting off mid-sentence, followed by silence that stretched far too long to be an accident. I stood up so fast my chair spun behind me. The station's translator drone hovered near my shoulder, waiting for me to speak, but I had nothing to say yet. I needed answers first. I found Counselor Threll in the central chamber, standing calm and unbothered, as if the silence from Marin Field was a weather pattern rather than 400 lives. When I asked him directly what had happened, he did not flinch. He told me the colony had expanded past its agreed boundary and that the correction had already been carried out. He said it the way someone might mention a light being switched off. No apology, no hesitation, just a simple statement, delivered like a policy update. I asked him to repeat himself, because some part of me refused to believe I had heard him correctly. He repeated it anyway, word for word, without a trace of doubt. That was the moment something inside me went still, not angry in the way people shout and slam doors. Quiet, focused, the kind of stillness that comes right before a decision that cannot be taken back. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned and walked out of that chamber, past counselors who had spent years speaking over me, past guards who had never once looked me in the eye, and out toward the shuttle bay where my ship waited. Behind me, I heard Threll say something about young species needing guidance. I did not turn around. I had already stopped listening. On the flight back to Earth space, I opened a private channel to Fleet Command. My hands were steady, though my mind was racing faster than the ship itself. I gave my report in short, clear sentences, because there was no time for anything else. Marin Field was gone. The council had confirmed it themselves. There would be no investigation, no trial, no accountability, only a shrug dressed up as policy. Command's response came back within minutes, and it was not what I expected. There was no debate, no committee, but just a single order, calm and absolute. Prepare every available ship, and stand by for a full change in posture. For years, humanity had been told to wait, to learn, to adapt quietly while the council decided how much space we deserved to take up. We had followed that advice because it seemed wise, because we were still finding our place among species older and stronger than us. But wisdom has a limit, and that limit had just been crossed in the sky above Marin Field. I did not know it yet, but the quiet years were over. By the time I reached the fleet staging point near Europa, the ships were already moving into formation. Pilots I had trained beside were running final checks with a focus I had never seen in them before. There was no shouting, no panic, just quiet determination, the kind that comes from people who have finally been given permission to stop holding back. I was given command of the lead ship, the Horizon, not because I asked for it, but because I was the only one who had stood in that chamber and heard the words myself. Command wanted someone who understood exactly what we were responding to. Our first move was not aimed at destruction. It was aimed at proof. We needed the council, all of them, not just the ones responsible for Marin Field, to understand that humanity had learned everything we needed to learn during those years of silence. We had studied their communication delays. We had mapped their patrol gaps. We had watched, carefully, patiently, exactly where their confidence made them careless. The Horizon moved without alerting a single council relay station. 6 years of watching paid off in 6 hours of movement. We arrived at the edge of the fleet responsible for Marin Field before their sensors even registered a change in the sky. I gave the order myself, and I gave it clearly, because there could be no confusion about intent. We were not there to erase anyone. We were there to stop a fleet that had already proven it would strike without warning, before it could do so again. The engagement lasted minutes, not hours. Their ships, built for slow negotiation and ceremonial displays of strength, were not prepared for a species that had spent years absorbing every weakness in their systems. Shields we had once been told were unbreakable, folded faster than anyone expected. Ships that had bombed innocent colonies without hesitation found themselves unable to answer a response built entirely around precision. We disabled every vessel involved in the strike on Marin Field, without destroying the stations nearby, without touching anyone who had not been part of that decision. It was not about anger. It was about consequence. delivered with a kind of discipline the council had never associated with humanity before. When the channel to Counselor Threll opened again, his voice had lost its earlier calm. He accused us of starting a war that could never be won, of throwing away centuries of careful diplomacy in a single reckless act. I answered him the way I had wanted to answer him for years, but never had the chance to. I told him this was not the start of a war. It was the end of a habit, one where a species could destroy a colony and call it correction, expecting no cost, no consequence, and no memory. He asked what we wanted in return for stepping back. I told him plainly, full recognition of human territory, without conditions attached later by committees who felt entitled to redraw lines whenever it suited them. A permanent voice in council decisions, equal to any founding species, with the power to stop unilateral actions like the one taken against Marin Field. And a public record, unedited and permanent, admitting exactly what had happened to those 400 people, so history would remember them as more than a footnote in someone else's policy. There was a long pause before he answered, longer than any pause I had heard from him before. When he finally spoke, it was not defiance. It was quiet, careful agreement, the tone of someone realizing the balance of power had shifted long before he noticed. Word spread quickly through the rest of the council. Species who had spent years watching the same patterns we had, who had grown tired of the same quiet arrogance, saw an opportunity they had never expected. Alliances that once excluded humanity entirely began reaching out instead, offering support, offering information, offering something none of them had offered before: respect. Within weeks, the chamber where I had once sat ignored looked completely different. Empty seats where old confidence used to sit. New voices, cautious but willing, filling spaces that had been closed off for longer than anyone could remember. I stood in that chamber again, this time not to listen quietly, but to speak. I laid out the new terms clearly, without anger, without theater, because none of that was needed anymore. Every species in that room understood exactly why we were there, and exactly what would happen if the same mistake was repeated. They agreed to every term, faster than I expected, not because they respected us more, though perhaps some of them did, but because they finally understood the cost of assuming otherwise. Threll was not in the chamber for the final vote. His seat had already been filled by someone new, someone who understood that the old approach no longer worked. I never learned what happened to him, and I never asked. Some questions did not need answers anymore. Walking out of that chamber for the final time, I did not feel triumphant. I felt something steadier than that, something closer to relief. 400 names that had almost been erased were finally spoken aloud, recorded permanently, impossible to dismiss again. We never wanted conflict. We wanted to be heard, to be treated as equals rather than a problem to manage quietly in the background. For years we gave the council our patience, hoping it would be recognized as strength rather than weakness. It took a single terrible decision for them to understand exactly what that patience had been worth all along. Nothing, until we decided it would cost them everything. And that is the moment humanity stopped holding back.